I mentioned once before that I was going to be telling an uplifting story. I had done so. Unfortunately, the volume was horrible, so you guys probably would not have been able to hear this type of thing anyway. Had you pressed play. I don't want the speakers to do all of the work for you guys, so I'm doing this over again. I'm raising my voice a lot more than I did, and I'm keeping the microphone a hell of a lot further away from my laptop. Since it is Father's Day, I wanted to share this, and since many of the people who were shot in South Carolina were parents, I want to make it a point to just extend my prayers for their families, and I think that pretty much covers it, but I'm going to take you back to another place where bigotry used to lie. One of the flags that this douchebag, whose name I am not going to mention, was wearing flags that featured the old South Africa with the apartheid regime and Rhodesia. I'm going to focus on the first half of it, the top half of it. Apartheid South Africa. Many people know that my father was born in South Africa, and as a result of that, he was born into apartheid. February 16th, 1948, Johannesburg, South Africa. Many people know that he passed away a couple of years ago. And in that same vein, South Africa's freedom fighter Nelson Mandela passed away that same year, later on. There is a connection between these two great men who are both South African. Let's give a little bit of a history lesson here about Nelson Mandela. He was arrested and he was thrown in jail for 27 years on Robben Island. After his release, quite a lot of people cheered. My father was a very staunch enemy of apartheid, whatever the word is that I'm trying to think, adversary of apartheid, whatever kind of bad thing that you could say about apartheid, that's how Dad felt about it. Let's flash forward a couple of years after his release. I think that's a very important place to go. 1990 was when he was released, and that same year I was a third grade student, and I was writing a report about his then wife, Winnie Mandela. So it seemed kind of like a strange coincidence that he was released the same year I was writing this book report. In 1993, he, along with F.W. de Klerk, were recipients of the Nobel Peace Prize. Very, very deserving by our standards. So, in 1994, every South African was given the ability to vote. Nelson's release set that tone. The Peace Prize set that tone. Very much so. The greatest thing is that if somebody had a South African passport, they were able to vote at the UN. Given that my father and my mother have lived in New York for some time, they moved into an apartment in Queens, and then they came to Staten Island. taking these things into account, it wasn't exactly that hard of a schlep to get to the United Nations from here. And every South African being able to vote was just such a momentous occasion. So much so that it took days, and I really do mean days, to do the ballot count. Nelson Mandela was on the ballot representing the African National Congress. My father really wanted to take the liberty to vote. He was still a citizen of South Africa, even living here. And then on top of all that, it's a civic duty that many people need to utilize more often. I'm at a point in my life where I'm a little bit disenchanted with the political system here. But for damn certain, I vote if only that I would be able to take the liberty of pulling the lever one way and then pulling it back the other way. or write a candidate in. But you know what? Let's stop digressing. My father wanted to take that liberty. Who would have thought that he would run into a friend of his family while waiting to vote? This was a man who was a flight attendant on South African Airways, and he and a bunch of other flight attendants were on a plane from Johannesburg to New York. They took the liberty of voting. I wasn't sure whether this was a direct stop or whether this was a one-way, whether it was just a direct flight, but whatever the case may be, they were there. And this man ran into my father, and it was a really momentous occasion, and, there was a big part of me that wished that he could have come while he was alive, that this man could have come while my father was alive in this day and age. I have that, or my mother and I, we have that with a number of people that we know from South Africa who have kept in touch with us. So, my father, obviously being a fervent opponent of apartheid, went to a tent and placed his vote, which was for Nelson Mandela. The hope came when, after all the ballots were counted, Nelson Mandela became the first black president of South Africa. It was no longer a regime of sheer and utter bigotry and prejudice. That fell down. And all countries have problems. Regime changes are never easy, even if they definitely are for the better. But Nelson was a good choice. He was an incredibly good choice. That's where hope lies. Hope lies in being able to know that you were instrumental in changing the world. Even if you are just one person. Because with that one person, you have a voice. And the one thing that I've learned over the years is even if you do not have the ability to speak, you always have an ability to change things. Because voice comes everywhere. Voice is every fiber within you. And when I think about my father, I know that I have made it a point to take the liberty of using my voice. My father had a stroke when he was about 21 years old. And then he regained his speech. He had to learn how to speak again. He was aphasic from that. 2 years, he was struggling with it. I can't even imagine having that type of disability occur. But on top of all of that, Dad always wanted to make it a point to change things. Dad always wanted to make it a point to, I guess you could say, just find ways to prove to himself that he was not going to be an invalid his entire life. He always kept thinking. He worked at Hoffman LaRoche, a major league drug company. He was responsible for research in developing a treatment for people with HIV and AIDS. I have that certificate somewhere in this living room. And when I think about that, I think about how proud he was that this happened. Even amid him having to go on disability because he was having MS flare-ups. That was a very hard thing for him, but he always made himself useful. Always. Even amid just watching movies on the Sundance Channel, and even amid doing his own research online, he's a great role model. And every day I make it a point to embody him. And I'm going to keep it that way. Happy Father's Day, everybody. Hope your memories are as good as mine.